What was the American Renaissance? Presented by Tanya Valles. America saw a tremendous flowering of literature after the 1830s. Before, most of the literature was intended to be functional, from stories of voyages to politics. The American Renaissance changed that when the writers began to publish some of their writings in an artistic way. Here's an overview of what's being discussed during this presentation. 3 influential authors of the American Renaissance will be presented. How did the periods of culture, politics, and religion shape the American Renaissance? What is Transcendentalism? The role of Transcendentalism that played during the American Renaissance, and the special roles of poetry during the American Renaissance. Influential authors of the American Renaissance. There were many authors during the American Renaissance, but in this presentation we'll be discussing about Ralph Waldo Emerson, Walt Whitman, and Henry David Thoreau, and how they influenced the American Renaissance. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Ralph Waldo Emerson was an American poet. He was considered the father of American literature, work in the ministry, focus on nonconformity, self-reliance, and anti-institutionalism. Trust thyself was Emerson's motto. Emerson's first book, who he wrote in 1836, Nature, is perhaps the best way he was able to express transcendentalism. His poetry, on the other hand, is often described as being harsh. Among Emerson's most well-known works are essays, first and second series, which were written during 1841 and 1844. The first series included Emerson's famous essay, Self-Reliance, in which instructs the listener to examine their relationship with nature and God, and to trust their own judgment above all others. Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman worked as a printer in New York City until the devastating fire in the printing district demolished the industry. In 1836, at the age of 17, he began his career as a teacher in the one-room schoolhouse of Long Island. He continued to teach until 1841, when he turned to journalism as a full-time career. He founded a weekly newspaper named The Long Islander, and later edited a number of Brooklyn and New York papers. In 1848, Whitman left the Brooklyn Daily Eagle to become editor of the New Orleans Crescent. In 1855, Whitman took out a copyright of the first edition of Leaves of Grass, which consists of 12 untitled poems and a preface. He published the volume himself and sent a copy to Emerson in July of 1855. Whitman released a second edition of the book in 1856, containing 33 poems, a letter from Emerson praising the first edition, and a long open letter by Whitman with his response. During his lifetime, Whitman continued to refine the volume, publishing several more editions of this book. Henry David Thoreau. David Henry Thoreau was a bright student who eventually went to Harvard College, now known as Harvard University. There he studied Greek, Latin, as well as German. According to some reports, Thoreau had to take a break from school because of an illness. He graduated from college in 1837 and struggled with what to do next. During that time, an educated man like Thoreau might even pursue a career in the law, medical, or even in the church. After college, Thoreau became good friends with Ralph Waldo Emerson. Throughout Emerson, he became exposed to Transcendentalism. For a time, Thoreau lived with Emerson as a caretaker for his home. Emerson also used his influence to promote Thoreau's literature. Some of Thoreau's first works were published in the Dial, a Transcendentalism magazine, and Emerson gave Thoreau access to the lands that would inspire one of his greatest works. He began writing nature poetry in the 1840s with the help of Emerson. In 1845, Thoreau built a small home for himself on Walden Pond, on a property owned by Emerson. He spent more than 2 years there. He was seeking a simpler life. Thoreau flipped the standard routine of the time, where he experimented with working as little as possible, rather than engaging the pattern of working 6 days on and 1 day off. There he began his famous 2-year stay on Walden Pond, which he wrote in the master work, Walden. Thoreau also remained a devoted abolitionist until the end of his life. To support his cause, he wrote several works, including the 1854 essay, Slavery of Massachusetts. Thoreau also took the brave stand for Captain John Brown, a radical abolitionist who led an uprising against slavery in Virginia. He and his supporters raided a federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry to arm themselves in October 1859, but their plans were ruined. How did the period's culture, politics, and religion shape the American Renaissance? It renewed national self-confidence. Culture had a strong influence in changing and shaping the American Renaissance. Most American literature masterpieces were produced during this era. The authors of this time were taking less influence from both political and religious affiliation, and trying to gain a new identity and use culture and personal influence to project in their literature. There was also less political influence during this period. The new nation had politically gained its independence at this time. Religion also had less influence in the literacy works of this time due to the fact the new nation were trying to reinvent and redesign their own particular style. Transcendentalism. It was an intellectual movement during the New England Renaissance, roughly between 1836 and 1860. The leading Transcendentalists were Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. It began as an informal discussion club in Boston, but spread and influences many of its ideas still part of American culture today. The main idea of Transcendentalism, it was particularly interesting in the nature world and its relation to humanity. They also believe that if they explore the nature, they will come to know themselves, and also through the human spirit it reflects nature. What role did Transcendentalism play in the American Renaissance? It allowed for protest to the state of society and culture, awareness of corruption in religious and political institutions, self-reliance and independence. The impact of Transcendentalism on American literature can easily be seen today. For example, Emerson perpetuated the idea that writers are seers. It's the writer's duty to see the world clearly, to summon the world to life. Emerson called poets liberating gods. Literature was a platform to liberate people, to help them see what needs to be seen: nature, spiritually, self-identity, and social injustice. The Transcendentalists were forceful critics of slavery and gender inequality. In transcendental theory, every individual has to be respected because every individual has a universal soul. What was the special role of poetry in the American Renaissance? It pursued of individualism, showed the effects of political and religious movements. It sensed the self-worth of individual. Poetry was a way to articulate how nature can personally affect each one of us. Poets of the American Renaissance influenced society in the ways of demonstration and influenced others to use their emotions and instincts in expressing writing. In conclusion, the American Renaissance period brought a major cultural, social, political, and philosophical change. The pioneers who stood for the abolition of slavery, women's suffering, expansion, and literary experientialism challenged and withstood opposing to those who were comfortable with the old social order. These developments continue to influence our society today, despite overcoming major obstacles within the last century. Only we can take advantage of the present opportunities to influence and bring about positive change for our future generations.